Looks good, Josh.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So I'm Josh. I'm with the API support team here at IB. I've done a number of webinars in the past and some of the other API technologies. So if you're a developer and interested in the different technology as well, I definitely encourage you to check those out. There's some recorded webinars on the website on the Java, C#, Python, and C++ APIs as well that were all done this year. Today I'll be talking about the Excel APIs in particular. Excel APIs have been very popular since the beginning of the API, some probably 10 years ago. And we now actually have even an additional technology. So in the past, we've always had DDE, which stands for Dynamic Data Exchange, for more than 10 years, and also ActiveX. So those are two Microsoft technologies, which are ways of retrieving data from Trader Workstation into Excel in real time. And soon there's one in development, which I'll be discussing today as sort of a sneak peek. Currently it is only in beta, but it will be available publicly very soon, and that's the RTD server. At the current moment, it can be used to get real-time data, and that's expected to be expanded in the future, so please stay tuned on future developments. Okay, so first I'll talk a bit about the API in general terms, just in terms of what the Trader Workstation API is used for and what it can be used for. So the API from IB is available. We have several different APIs. There's one for Trader Workstation, which is available for all clients. So if you can log into TWS, you can also use the API. So I'll show where that is on our website. If you go under Trading and then API Solutions, that has all the different APIs currently available for connecting to IB. So these would be for tasks such as viewing your current positions in real time. Some of the APIs can view market data, replace orders. But for other tasks, like say historical data, like on your portfolio, that wouldn't be through one of the APIs. That would have to be through the flex queries and account management, or a different type of connection. So we also offer, in addition to the APIs, we also offer different connectivity types, like a fixed connection, which is a way of using the fixed protocol to place orders to IB. Typically, it's used by high-volume traders or institutional clients who place large numbers of orders. And that requires a separate setup. And in fact, all the other APIs do. There's also a web API for market data for white-branded institutional brokers. And so that's if you're an institutional broker, introducing broker, and you'd like to give access to your clients to market data through a web-based interface, that is also available. But today I'll just be talking about the Trader Workstation API. So I'll click on that link to show the page which has all the different technologies available. So the API, as I mentioned, is available to anyone who has access to Trader Workstation. Trader Workstation is IB's desktop trading environment, so it's used for most tasks. And it has a number of specialized programs. It can do other things, like there's a program called Risk Navigator, there's an option trader, a book trader. So it has a number of other tools as well. The API in general can't access those specialized tools, but it can be used for tasks such as viewing real-time market data, getting historical data, or placing orders. For things like historical positions, as I mentioned, since that's not available in Trader Workstation, that's only available through account management. It also isn't available through the API. So the API and TWS are really focused around trading-based activities and information that would be needed to trade in real time. Okay. So the technologies we currently offer would be C#, C++, Java, and Python. And those are all available in either any type of platform. And then on Windows, we do also offer the Excel APIs. The reason they're only on Windows is because they use Microsoft Excel, and they use some Microsoft-specific technologies which aren't generally offered on other platforms. Okay, so this has an overview of the different API technologies. And then it also has links to actually download the API itself. Anybody can download the API, just like anyone can download Trader Workstation. It is free to download from our website. And actually, the beta version of the API is now hosted open source on the GitHub site. It's an open source repository for developers. So if you sign up for access, which doesn't cost anything, you can actually make suggestions about the API source itself, or even submit what are known as pull requests, which are just ways to change the code to, say, add new features or to do something differently. So if you're a developer, I would definitely encourage that. It's really a great way to be part of the API community. I went a little too fast there. The first page was actually a license agreement. That's a non-commercial license agreement, and you need to agree to that before you download the API. That page also has instructions about, I'll show the agreement. If you're using it for commercial purposes, this also has the instructions on how you can request a commercial license agreement. But if you just need it for non-commercial purposes, you can just click on agree. And then this is the actual API download site. You'll notice it's hosted on GitHub, because that's where the actual source code is hosted. And then we'll have a couple different versions. One will be for Windows, and that includes those extra Excel-based technologies. And then we also have one for Mac. The only difference really is the Windows installer is an MSI installer. So when you run that, you'll need to be an administrator in your computer, because it will install the ActiveX and other controls, which will be loaded up into Excel. And those do have to be registered on a Windows system in order to be used. And so that's why you need to be an administrator, and why it's packaged as MSI installer, so that it can do that for you. One thing to keep in mind, with the MSI installer, it only comes pre-packaged with the 32-bit versions of the controls. So if you want to load that into a 64-bit application, say like MATLAB or say Excel 64-bit, that would actually have to be recompiled in the 64-bit mode. So we do provide open source projects for like real-time data server, for ActiveX, or for any of the other APIs except for DDE. So those can be built on your own system to meet your own specific requirements. I mean, really, it's pretty straightforward too. The only really hard part is downloading Visual Studio for Microsoft, which is generally free for individuals, but it's a large program. But I'll show here in a minute how that can be done. The TWS RTD server, as I mentioned, is currently only available in beta. So to have access to the beta, you actually do have to have a GitHub credentials. So if you happen to have those, they're free to sign up for, but if you happen to have those, you can download it now. But otherwise, it would be necessary if you want to wait until it's promoted to latest. That will be available here pretty soon in the next few days. But this webinar will be recorded today, so if you ever needed to come back and to double check on anything, it will be available on the website. Okay. That's the first step. I should also mention on here is a link to the API reference guide. So if you click on here, that'll take you right to the reference guide. And this has code samples and all the different technologies available, including the other ones I mentioned for the API, and also has separate sections for the Excel APIs. So you'll find a link here for Dynamic Data Exchange, and also for the TWS RTD server, which is the newest API, just released recently in beta, and for market data. So right now with RTD server, it's only for real-time market data if you want to pull prices in real time, and that should be expanded. It is expected to be in the future. Okay, so in here, we have tons of examples on the syntax for different types of requests. So if you want to say request data for stocks or Forex or options or spread contracts, we have all those examples in here. In the Dynamic Data Exchange section, we have examples and actual tutorials for both requesting real-time or historical data in Excel. Historical data is a little more complicated in DDE because it's not just a single cell which needs to be updated. It's a whole batch of data. So it does require a bit of VBA coding. That's Visual Basic for applications in Excel to be able to process and parse that data and place it into the correct cells in Excel. Okay, so this is our documentation site. Definitely useful to have bookmarks. This is updated very often. Okay, and so after you download the API from the site, depending on the version you choose, you would install it. You need to have administrator access because I mentioned it has to be registered. I've already done that here on this computer. So after it installs, it should install on the C drive. Otherwise, you might have trouble. Some of the sample programs might have trouble finding where it's located to a folder called TWS API. If you open that up, they'll have two subfolders. One is called Samples, one is called Source. Samples is all the sample code, so like the sample spreadsheets for the Excel, which I'll be talking today, one for each of the different technologies, and then also a folder for the source code. So all the APIs are all open source. So if you're a developer, this is really the best resource because you actually have the actual source code. So you can look into there to see how the API does different things and its exact capabilities. RTD server is written in C#, so you would find that underneath the C# client. The actual TWS RTD server control. So this has a Visual Studio project, which can be loaded directly in the Visual Studio. You would need at least version 2012. I'll be using 2017 today, but as long as it's higher than 2012 or higher, then you'll be able to load this project directly and then build it. And then you could build it for your own system. Like if you have 32-bit Excel, you could build the 32-bit version. Or if you have 64-bit Excel, you just need to change the setting, and then you can build it for 64-bit Excel. And then you'll also notice the ActiveX control is also a separate folder within the source code. So the same consideration would apply here. You could build this for your own particular system, depending on if you're building it for a 32 or a 64-bit application. Okay, and then DDE isn't actually open source. We do have a sample project, but when you run the MSI installer for the Windows API, it will copy the necessary dynamic link library into your Windows folder so that you won't have to do anything else. You can just load up an Excel spreadsheet, and then it can directly access that dynamic link library. Okay, see, the first thing I'll talk about would be, so I'll start off with the RTD server to show how that can be loaded into Visual Studio to build it for your own particular system here. So if we go back into TWS API and then into the source code, we go into C# client, TWS RTD server, and then the Visual Studio solution would be marked by a .sln file. So as I mentioned, to register and install the ActiveX control which is created, that would need to be, you need to run Visual Studio in administrator mode. So that's what I'll do here. I'll find Visual Studio, and you can just do a right click on it, and then go to More, and then Run as Administrator. Okay, and I'll load up Visual Studio. Okay, and then I'll just open the TWS RTD server project. Let's see, I'll have to find it here. Okay, so this is the actual TWS RTD server source code. So you see it's all open source, which is very useful. It has a ton of information in here about things like different tick types, which I'll talk about later, which exact tick types are defined and what they map to, the exact requests which are being made through the API to do different things. So the TWS RTD server just sort of piggybacks upon the C# API. So the C# API is one of the core supported languages. And so the TWS RTD server is able to call functions within there to do different tasks to request real-time data. Okay, and we'll see here, so the actual name of the installed control itself, which we'll use later in the Excel spreadsheet, is TWS RTD server CTRL. Okay, and then this just has to be built to register it on your system. So you would choose here, like by default, 64-bit here. You could also choose 32-bit if you're running 32-bit Excel. You just need to go into the configuration manager. Then you go here and choose new platform, and then choose x86. And so that would switch the 32-bit version, which you would just build in the same way, and that would register that control on your system instead. Okay, so I'll just show how this be built. So you just do rebuild solution. Okay, and that just rebuilds it. And you can see it has the full path to where it's installed to, and it was successful. So that's all we need to do there. So now if we go into Excel, we can actually load this directly up. I should mention, so when I speak about these different technologies, RTD server, DDE, or ActiveX, sometimes clients who aren't familiar with them think they're invented by IB. They are actually from Microsoft, so these are Microsoft technologies which have been invented to be used for a lot of different things, not necessarily just IB's API or even trading, of course. So these are different technologies introduced by Microsoft. They each have their own advantages and disadvantages. The reason we have 3 now would be partly for backwards compatibility. So DDE has been around in ActiveX since the beginning, more than 10 years. They are now older technologies, so they're completely sufficient for a lot of tasks. We have a lot of IB clients who have used them for a very long time, so we continue to support them, in part for backwards compatibility, because if something's working, why why change it? And also because each technology has its own advantages and disadvantages. So RTD Server was actually a new technology introduced by Microsoft to sort of cope with some of the deficiencies, the other technologies, and the special challenges of using Excel, which is a very multi-purpose application, and connecting it to other applications, in this case, Trader Workstation. Okay. So what I've done is actually written up a short comparison of the different technologies which are offered, and to see compare and contrast them. Okay. So this is just an overview in very, very basic terms to see what is available and where the preference is, why you might choose a specific technology over another. So they are all available. For getting real-time market data, you can use RTD Server, DDE, or ActiveX. ActiveX at the current moment is the most functional. So to do anything else, like to receive every possible type of data in real time that's offered through the API, you would need to use ActiveX. To do other tasks like the most cutting-edge technology available from the API, that would require ActiveX. And so DDE has most technology. You can place orders, get account values, get portfolio information, but now it is sort of frozen in IB's repository, so it's no longer currently being updated. So as new functions are added, they actually won't be incorporated into DDE, just into the other technologies. Okay, so that would be one reason you might want to use ActiveX, if there's a very specific reason why you'd want to use something that's not available from the other technologies. I should mention also ActiveX is by far the hardest to program. It does require a lot of more VBA coding, and so that's why we try to emphasize, it's more really available for developers than the casual Excel user. We do offer a sample spreadsheet, but to expand on that would seriously take some considerable programming work. So that would be one of the disadvantages of ActiveX. The next advantage, which is really something I wanted to highlight with RTD Server, is the easy-to-use formulas. So these have been simplified considerably with RTD Server, which is one of the things I really like about it. So they're much shorter now, and it's actually very straightforward, and you can start using it right away. Whereas to use DDE, though you don't need VBA code to use to make real-time market data requests, it does have more complicated formulas. And actually, you need to use 2 cells for your request, whereas you only need 1 with RTD Server. And then ActiveX, as I mentioned, you need to use VBA code for any task. So that does make it more challenging from a programming perspective. Okay. And then another advantage of RTD Server would be it actually has been designed specifically by Microsoft to not overwhelm Excel with data. So Excel, as I mentioned, is a general application. It's not just for trading. So it was designed by Microsoft really to give priority to user interaction. So that's the first priority of Excel. And this is a disclaimer in terms of using Excel as a general purpose trading application. IB does offer a lot of other technologies which can be used to design custom-made trading applications, and of course there are many other applications out there which can be used with the API. If you're interested in using Excel, that's certainly suitable for a number of tasks, but it does have some inherent limitations. Okay, so specifically from a development standpoint, Excel gives precedence to user interaction. So if the user is doing something, Excel will give precedence to that over something happening in the background, like receiving trade execution data from Trader Workstation or receiving real-time market data, which in many cases is very important, and you don't necessarily want a trading application to not give precedence to that interaction. So that's just something to keep in mind, which has made making trading applications in Excel in some ways can be more challenging because of that. So with RTD Server, with that limitation in mind, Microsoft made a new methodology. So RTD Server, how it would work, is the application will actually, it lets Excel know, the control lets Excel know when there's new data. And then it lets Excel actually say when it's ready to accept the new data. And so in that way, unlike the other technologies, which just send data constantly, then RTD Server will only download data when it's ready. So in that way, it's much less likely to be overwhelmed if there's too much market data coming in at the same time. And it's much less likely to potentially drop any events, which could be very important. So that's one of the other reasons why we're developing our new RTD server technology and why it's potentially advantageous over the others. Okay, as I mentioned, the two open source technologies at the moment would be RTD server and ActiveX. DD, unfortunately, is not open source. And then the market data refresh rate is slightly slower in ActiveX, though that's perfectly suitable for a number of tasks. And then is 250 milliseconds for stocks and futures, which is actually the snapshot frequency of IB's market data. IB's market data isn't actually tick by tick. It consists of snapshots which occur about 4 times a second. And so these technologies are able to cope with the maximum rate of data. And then in terms of using one of these technologies with 64 or 32-bit Trader Workstation, limitation of DDE, it does have to be used with 32-bit version of TWS, whereas the other two technologies can be recompiled for either the, or actually they don't even need to be recompiled because they're socket-based, but they can be used with either 32-bit or 64-bit TWS. And then finally, as I mentioned, the MSI installer for Windows only installs the 32-bit versions of the controls. So in terms of out of the box, unfortunately, RTD server and ActiveX, if you have 64-bit Excel, you would need to recompile the control in 64-bit mode to use those with a 64-bit version of Excel, whereas DD can be used with either 32-bit or 64-bit. Okay. Okay, so that's just an overview of the different Excel APIs and how they compare and contrast. Next, I'll go into some actual examples of using Excel to actually pull data in real time from Trader Workstation to show just the steps necessary. It's actually, once you've compiled and installed the RTD server, it's actually fairly straightforward. Okay, so the first step, these are interfaces to Trader Workstation. So you need to be logged in and have installed Trader Workstation or IB Gateway. IB Gateway is an alternative to TWS, which is actually based on many of the same jar files. These are both Java-based programs, so they can run on any platform which supports Java. So that would be Windows, Mac, or Linux. And IB Gateway, the only difference really is it doesn't have a complicated user interface. From the API, it's essentially identical. Many users like it because it's a smaller program, and also because it doesn't have the daily auto log-off limitation of TWS. So TWS is designed to log off daily. You can actually change that time when it logs off by going into the global configuration menu and then going to the lock and exit. And this is where you would change that time in which Trader Workstation will automatically shut down, but this can't be disabled. It can only be changed. Whereas IB Gateway, for some purposes, is advantageous because it can run for longer periods. Okay, but otherwise, everything I'll have to say today would be equally applicable to either program. They're essentially identical from the API. Okay, so after you've logged in and launched TWS, you'll notice, by the way, this is a simulated trading account. You can notice because of the red bar at the top. Also, the account number starts with D. D stands for demo. Any account number at IB starting with D will be a demo account. Okay, but you can use any of the APIs with either a demo account or a lab account. In fact, it's actually recommended to first test an API in a demo account before moving to a lab environment, especially if you're placing orders or doing something of that type. Okay. So there, in the global configuration menu in TWS, there's a separate section for the settings, which would need to be first enabled to use the API. By default, the API won't be enabled in TWS, so you just need to change the settings in order to enable it. To get there, this is the classic view of TWS. From the classic view, you click on Edit, and then Global Configuration, and then go to API, and then Settings. So these are the API settings, which would affect the connection. Those are probably the only ones you'll ever change. Most of these other settings, you would just leave as defaults for the vast majority of users. But the connection settings do need to be enabled the first time you launch TWS. And after that, after you save the settings that way, then you won't have to do it again. So for all the API technologies, except for DDE, you would need to check this first box, Enable ActiveX and Socket clients. So that includes ActiveX, RTD Server, or say any of the other socket-based technologies like C#, Java, or C++. For DDE in particular, you do need to check the second box. You probably want to check them both. Most users would either have one or the other technology, so you can if you like. And so that's all you need to do to enable the connection. For the socket-based technologies, that is everything but DD, you do also have to specify a socket port. So by default, in the Trader Workstation Live session, it'll be on socket port 7496. In the paper session, it'll be on 7497. So that's actually a number specified in the API application, which is used to connect to a running session of TWS. And if you have multiple running sessions, as I actually do here, then each session has to be on a different socket port so that when an API client is connecting, it can specify which session of TWS it wants to connect to. Okay, so that's why the live trading and the paper trading session are typically on different ports. Here, even though it's a paper trading session, I have it on 7496, just for demonstration purposes. Okay, so that's the other setting you need for the socket-based technologies. And then there is one additional setting. So when you first connect from the API, from a socket-based technology, there'll be a little confirmation box that pops up to ask if the incoming connection can be accepted from the API, just for security reasons. If you want to bypass that and allow connections automatically, you would also need to check this box to allow connections from localhost only. So that's the only other one you might change. I should mention, though, that if you ever contact API support, one of the first things that we'll ask about would be the TWS log files. So Trader Workstation can actually create two different log files of all its activities. One is for the TWS and one is for the API. And if you troubleshoot an API issue, to actually see those messages which are being sent across a socket, you can do that by creating a text file with all those messages after setting this to detail. So by default, it'll be on the lowest level, which is system or error. And if you change the detail, then that'll create a record of all the API messages. Also, there's another box here to check called Create API Message Log File, which will create a separate log file of just the API messages themselves. So if you ever contact API support with a specific issue, say like there's a particular instrument that you want to define and you're not able to define it and you're not sure why, usually a lot of times if we can't figure out why immediately, the next step in troubleshooting would be to change these settings to create a log file of all those messages being sent across the socket. Okay. One other thing I should mention. So those are general settings for DD or socket-based technologies. As I mentioned before, with DD, you do have to be running a 32-bit version of TWS. So this happens to be a 32-bit version of TWS. It looks essentially identical. It is for most tasks. The only exception might be if you're using a ton of memory, like if you're using a tool like Risk Navigator, or you have dozens of charts open in TWS or some other task which would use a ton of memory. You might notice more of a difference with the 64-bit TWS, but otherwise they're essentially the same. So to use DD in particular, you do need to be running 32-bit TWS, just something to keep in mind. Okay, so after I've changed those settings, I'll just click Apply and OK. And now both the socket-based technologies and DD will be both enabled. The first time you do that, you'll see a little notification box pop up. I've done it before in here, so it doesn't. And I'll just let you know about any new additions that come out with this API version. Okay, so now our Trader Workstation is running and it's listening for incoming socket port connections. So the next step would actually be to make those requests from Excel itself. So first I'll show that with RTD server to show how simple I think it is and compare to the other technologies. Okay, so I'll just launch Excel here and I'll start off on a blank spreadsheet. Okay, so we just have a blank workbook for Excel. The first thing we should check would be to make sure that the RTD server has been installed so Excel can find it, and that it's also visible, that it can be loaded into this version of Excel. So if we go into the VBA code editor, you can get there by using the keys Alt and F11 if you hold those down at the same time. Okay, and then we can see what controls are visible to Excel by going to Tools and then References. Okay, so this shows all the different ActiveX controls or controls you have installed on your system, as well as, so these will be enabled by default, and these are other ones which are available. So if you remember from the source code in that control, the actual name of it is TWS.TWS RTD server. So that's the one we have to look for here. Okay, so in Excel, we'll search down references until we find that to make sure that it's here, and then it can be loaded into Excel. Okay. So there we are. Just scroll past it. TWS RTD server. So we'll just check that. Click OK. Okay, and we didn't receive any error messages, so it was loaded OK. Go back into references. You can see it is now enabled, TWS RTD server. So that's all you need to do. And this is one of the things I like about TWS RTD server. You don't need to be using VBA code like you do with, say, ActiveX. Okay, so then in the actual spreadsheet, we can just type a command directly into a cell that will pull a particular type of data, say such as the current bid price for Apple stock on NASDAQ. And for the syntax of how to do that, we can refer back to the documentation guide. So if you go back to the reference guide here on the website, we can find the TWS RTD section. And this goes through an introduction, a lot of the same things I was just talking about. So it talks about the API version, which is the beta, soon to be promoted to latest, which is currently 97303. And then the build of TWS, the setting changes, which we just did in Trader Workstation, and then the actual syntax of a request itself. So there are actually different ways to make requests with the RTD formula. There are what we call a simple syntax, which just requires less typing, or there is a more complex syntax. The difference is that in the simple syntax, you don't actually label each of the fields. So you don't label like what AAPL is. You just let the system know, try to guess, and it's very good at guessing, and they'll be able to guess whether that's the stock symbol. Whereas in the complex syntax, if you want to be more precise, you can actually explicitly define what that would refer to. So you can see here in the complex syntax, in your request, you would be actually saying symbol is IBM, security type is SDK for stock, exchange is island, so that means you want to receive data from the NASDAQ ECN, which is island, and the type of quote is as size. In the simple syntax, you don't actually label each parameter. You just put them in a string in that same order, and then the RTD server can actually infer what the fields are. So here you can say you don't actually label anything explicitly. You just say IBM at island, and then the type of quote, and that will automatically be able to pull that quote. Okay, so I'll show a few different examples here of different types of requests. Okay, let's start out with something simple. We'll start off first by looking at, say, the last price of Apple. So we want to have that streaming into Excel from Trader Workstation. So we'll do something very similar. So here's the syntax for, say, IBM bid size. So another thing I should mention, there are default values for these different fields which are available. For example, for what we'd call the tick type, which in this case is bid size, that's the type of data, that will be defaulted to last. So it'll be defaulted to the last value. So if you were to leave this blank, it would just pull in the last value by default. If you want something different, you would actually specify that out. And here we have a list of the different tick types available. So there are quite a few. You can get the bid, the ask, the daily high, the daily low, the volume, the prior close from the previous day, today's open, as well as what we call generic tick types, which are the more specialized, less commonly used tick types. We have quite a few of those as well. This would be things like auction values. So if you wanted the opening or closing auction of stock, you can sign for that. You can get information about the market price, which is used in credit decisions when it looks at the current market value. You can look at things like shortability. So if you want to see if a stock is currently shortable, we don't offer the exact number of shares, unfortunately, from the API, but you can get different types of information about how many shares are currently shortable of a security. Or if you want to say Reuters fundamentals, things like the PE ratio, that's available for the fundamentals. So there are quite a few options here, and they can be used in many different creative ways. So basically all you would need to do would be to specify this is the tick type field for the type of data that you actually would like. Okay, so in making a market data request on RTD server, generally there are two things you need to define. One is the instrument you want data for, and then the second one would be the type of data that you're looking for that instrument. Okay, so this would be the example for IBM bid size, I'll do something very similar to that, except I'm going to look at the Apple last value. So I'll start off, and all the RTD commands would start the same way. You would have RTD in capital letters to let Excel know this is an RTD request. Then you have to actually reference the RTD control. And most likely you would actually just put up a reference to this, because for every single command it will be exactly the same. So if you just put this in a cell, this is that name of that control. Okay. Oh. Okay. And then we would just make a reference to that. So we'll do equals RTD, capital letters, and then cell A1. Okay. The next parameter will typically be blank. So as I mentioned, RTD server is a general technology available by Microsoft. So this would be the beginning syntax of any RTD request. And then RTD request, the second parameter would be the server. So if you happen to have the actual RTD server running on a different system, and you need to specify where it is, then you would specify that here. In all our cases, this will always be just left blank because it's on the same computer, which would be the default. Okay, and then the next parameter would be the ticker symbol. In this case, would be Apple. Okay, and then and that's actually all we need to specify. So this will default to the last tick type, and then it will also default to a TWS session running on socket port 7496. So that will be the default. And as I mentioned, we previously checked the TWS session was on that socket port. But that's something to keep in mind. If you have TWS running on a different port number, that would also need to be specified separately. You wouldn't be able to use the default. But that's actually all we need. And then you can see it'll pull the last traded price for Apple, which continues to update. So we'll just label that here. Okay, so then we could, getting other values would be very similar. Like if we wanted the bid price, we would just do RTD. Then we would name the control, which is pulling data. We'd do Apple again. Oh, and the other defaults, by the way, which are in the documentation, would be security type as SDK, currency as USD, and exchange is smart. So if you don't define anything else, it's always going to assume this ticker symbol stands for a US stock, and it's going to smart route the request. So smart routing means that it's going to pull data from any available exchange where it trades, whereas a direct routing request would be from a particular exchange. So the direct routing request can be a bit misleading because that might not be the best price currently for a security. For someone like Apple, it's very likely to be because it trades so frequently. But for a less commonly traded security, it might actually be the best price, which means if you were to route an order to that same exchange, it might not necessarily be executed. Okay. So we'll do, again, using the defaults, which is US stocks in the smart route request. Then we'll pull data, say this time for the bid price. Okay, so now we have the last and the bid, and those continue to update in real time. Okay, and so this is Apple with Smart. I'll make that more explicit here. Okay, but if you want to do something similar, say like Apple, and instead you want the price just from the native exchange, which would be Island in this case. Island is the ECN for NASDAQ. So that is one thing that tricks people up sometimes. Anytime you want anything to specify NASDAQ from the API, you would always use Island. Most other the exchange names would be exactly the same. So if you want like NYSE, BATS, ARCA, you would use just that word. But for NASDAQ, you would always use Island. Okay, and then we can just do the RTD server. Okay, and then do Apple, and this time we'll do @Island. Okay, and then we don't have to do anything else since it'll be the default value. And you can see it's going to be very, very similar because that's a huge exchange, of course, which probably has most of the volume of Apple. And then for the bid, it would be just pretty much exactly the same. Okay. And then I'll just show one other example. Let's say we want to get dividend information. That is available. We just need to look up to see how that's defined in the API. So if we go under the generic tick types and scroll down until we find dividends, this gives information about how it's defined and also how it's interpreted. So when you request dividends for a particular instrument, it's reported as 4 different fields separated by semicolons. So that would be dividends for the past 12 months, dividends for the next 12 months, the next dividend date, and also the next single dividend amount. So the format will look like this when it's returned. And then if you wanted it to be further separated, it would need to be further parsed. Okay, so we'll just do, if we want to look at dividends, and then you can see, so our request, this is what's so great about RTD server, they all look very the same. You basically only change one parameter to get a different tick type. Okay. So this would be the dividends for the past 12 months. Dividends for the next 12 months would be 2.54 a share. The next ex-dividend date and dividend amount. So the next dividend date is supposed to be August 7th, 2017, 0807, with an amount of 0.63. And then to do other stocks would be very, very similar. You would just need to define something, a different ticker symbol here. Okay, so next I'll show a few other examples. I can do, let's see, maybe what should I do? Maybe I could do a future. Let's do a future. So if we want to do a future contract, the syntax will be a little different. There are different parameters which need to be defined. Specifically, you need to have like the expiry for a future, which wouldn't really exist within a stock, but would exist with a future or a warrant or an option. So for that reason, the syntax will be just a bit different. But we have some examples here. We scroll down, go to server samples for futures. We can use a simple syntax, just because it's less typing. So this would be the general syntax for making a futures request. If we want to see all the fields, let's see, we should have them up here. Okay, so this would be the general format for making a request in the simple syntax. So the field would be simple exchange, primary exchange. Primary exchange is something only used with smart route stocks. And that's because smart isn't actually an exchange, so you need to define the actual exchange of the contract where it natively trades. And that's the only time you'd use primary exchange. So if you're defining something like a future, since it's not smart routed, you'll just leave that blank, which is denoted here by the double slash. And then you have security type, which would be FUT, expiration, so that would be the expiration of this particular instrument. And then say if it's an option, you would have the right strike. Here for a future, we wouldn't have those. And then finally the currency. So this would be the format of defining the ES and Globex. Okay, so we can actually just copy that verbatim. Okay, and I'll just label this for the ES Mini. That's a symbol, and it trades on Globex. That's the only place it trades, unlike on stocks. Okay, this will still be the last. I'll do the same, start the same way. Oh, double quotes. Okay, and so that would give us the last price for the ES Mini. And by the way, if you ever want to double check, this will be the exact same data in TWS. So it's always good practice to double check in TWS to make sure the same data is being pulled. So we can find those same contracts on the TWS watch list. First we'll do Apple. Okay, and after you choose Apple, you have to make sure you choose the right one. So this is also a smart routed contract. So we'll just enter that into our watch list. And then if we take a look at these same fields, you can see they're just the same. So the last price is 144.88, the bid price. And then the ask price is changing in real time, but it will match the same prices here. Okay, and then the same for the ES Mini. If we add the ES Mini to a watch list, we'll go to futures, and then this is the September. Actually, I think it's the December. Let me double check. Oh yeah, so it's the December 2017 future. So that's the one we want to select here to make sure they match. And then we'll have the last price of $24.35. And then if you want to define say, the bid or any other pick type, it would be done in the same way. Okay, so that's a future contract. Let's do something more complicated, more adventurous. So you can also do spreads, like if you want to do like a future spread or an option spread, so like even something very complicated like an iron condor that is available. So let's do something a bit more complicated here. Okay, so we have a section on spreads here. So in defining spreads, there are a lot more parameters, as you might expect. So if you want to define a spread contract, what you would need to do would be to find what we call the contract ID or the cone ID of each of the legs. So in this case, this is a spread with two different instruments. So it's looking at interactive broker stock and McDonald's stock. And so basically it's looking at the price difference between those and requesting that in real time. To do that, we would need to first find the contract ID of interactive broker stock and the contract ID of McDonald's stock and use that to build the request. This is done, we use the contract IDs here because otherwise it would be very, very long. If you had to specify each of these parameters for each of the legs, and you could have up to, say, 4 legs, you can imagine how long that would be. So using the contract ID simplifies this considerably. To find that number, I'll show how that can be done. It can be done through different API technology, or it can be done through using the IB contract and search database, which can be accessed directly from TWS. So here, let's do something like an option spread. So we'll look at 2 expiries. We'll make maybe a vertical spread of Apple. First, we'll make in TWS, and then we'll try to pull the same data from the API. Okay. Oh, yep. Okay, so let's first pull an Apple option. We'll choose an option expiring, say, Friday the 30th. Okay, with a strike. Actually, let's do a spread. Make that directly. So we go to combinations and do option combos. Then you can choose vertical spread. It'll be on the 30th. It'll be a call spread. Okay, the first leg will be at 140. The second leg will make it 145. Okay, we'll choose that. So that'll enter into a watch list as well as the legs. Okay, so you can see in real time, these are the values provided by IB for this option contract. It's a bull call spread expiring June 30th, 140 to 145. And for that combo, you can get the bid and the ask, just like you can get the bid and the ask for each of the legs independently. So from the API, you could define it in the same way. You could have one ticker row for the spread, or you can also have tickers for each of the legs. Okay, and to define that, we'll need to use that same syntax, which is denoted here. Okay, so let's see, how should we do this? First, I'll just go up to the general syntax. Oh, yeah, this would be best. Okay, so this is that where the combo is actually defined. This is the syntax for that. And then I'll just copy that into Excel to show how to be defined. Okay, and this is going to be an Apple spread. Okay. So first we'll have CMB equals, and then the first thing we need would be the contract ID of that first leg. So if we go back into TWS, we can find that. And how we find that, we'll do a right click on that instrument. And I should also mention, this is also great for finding any other parameters, not just the contract ID. But if you need anything like the exact expiry, the local symbol, the multiplier, those can all be found by entering the instrument into TWS and then doing a right click on it and going to Financial Instrument Info and then Description. So from description, you can find a ton of information all about that instrument, which can be used to define it from the API. Okay? And then you can also, if you go to Financial Instrument Info and then Details, that'll launch a web browser and take you right to the site, which has the contract ID. So that'll be this number here, which defines this, this option specifically. And that's the one we're going to use in the spreadsheet to create a combo from that. Okay, so that would be the first part. Combo equals the first con ID. Since we're buying the first leg, we're buying 1 of the first leg because it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So then we'll have 1. Then we'll do a buy. Okay, and then it'll be smart routed. These are both smart routed options. So that'll be the first leg. Then we have to find the contract ID of the second leg. So we'll go back to TWS. We'll do a right click on the second instrument, go to financial instrument info, and then details. Okay, then we'll find the contract ID here. Go back to Excel and put that in our formula. Okay, and then again, the ratio will be 1. So we're selling this leg, so this will be a sell. Okay, and then this will also be smart routed. Okay, so that's most of the work in defining the combo, would be that part of the string. And then we do have the rest of the string, which we can find from our syntax here. And that would be for the option spread. It would be very similar to this. Let's see. So using that as a reference, okay, we'll do RTD, just as before. We'll reference the cell which has the name of the control. And then this time, so it's an Apple option contract spread. So we'll do Apple, and it's smart routed. The whole combo is smart routed. And then for a spread contract, you always do a bag, which just means it's a bag of contracts or a number of different contracts. And then those other parameters will just leave blank since those are not used with the combo definition itself. And then it'll be USD. Okay, and then we'll need to reference this, the combo itself to show what the legs are. So that would be cell A14. Okay, and that should be all we need. Interesting. Let's see, what am I missing? There we go. Okay. So this would be the last price because that is the default, and we can check that. I'll just label that to make sure we don't forget. If we go back in the TWS for that instrument, you can see the actual last price is indeed 418. So that's an example of how you could create an option spread. You can do that in many different creative ways. You can add additional legs to your combo. You could even do something like if you want an iron condor and you want to have the bid, ask, and last prices, you could certainly do that. So that's what I like about RTD Server. I mean, it's fairly straightforward to be able to create even these very complicated spread contracts. Okay, so that's RTD Server. So I think I've tried to make a case for all the reasons why we've started to develop in that area and why I like it. Let me also discuss. Oh, I should also mention. So with the IB installation itself of the API, it actually does include sample spreadsheets in each of the technologies. So one would include an RTD server. So if we go into the Excel, so this would be, if you go back into the C drive, and then TWS API, and then go into samples, and then Excel, it'll actually have the samples. So one of those will include the one for RTD server. So this has a number of examples as well, and is very useful. I'm kind of showing what a possible complete spreadsheet might look like. So this has a number of different predefined requests, which are all pointing to port 7496. And so all you need to do basically is put an equal sign before a request to actually evaluate the formula after it. And in this cell, it does that by using a macro, which just puts an equal sign before each cell to actually make Excel evaluate that expression. So if you just click Start, that will create all the different requests and be able to actually pull data then in real time. You can see there are some errors here, and that has to do with just like if we click on this error, we can see this is no security definition has been found. This is a very common error in the API. It just means there's a missing or incorrect parameter in a contract definition. So this has more information, by the way. If we go back to the documentation guide, there's a whole section on troubleshooting common errors, and that has more information about how this could be troubleshot, if we look at, should be one of the ones listed here. Yeah, so it says more information about that specific error. Okay. In that case, I mean, I think in this case, yeah, because this is already expired, so that's why we're receiving that error from June 16th, which expired last week. And then we also have other tickers here, other examples. So if you click on the USD tab and then click Start, it will populate cells in the same way. There's some errors here because Yahoo has actually changed its symbol. But this gives an idea of what the API is capable of providing in all the different fields available. So this has some things like, say, average volume, 13-week high, 13-week low, short-term volume, trade count. So it has a ton of different types of information which can be pulled from the API. Okay, then I'll just briefly discuss the other technologies and the sample spreadsheets which we provide with those. So we also provide sample spreadsheets. If you're interested in a different technology, there'll be one for DDE or one for ActiveX. So I'll show what those look like. So in DDE, this is a sample spreadsheet. As I mentioned before, to make a market data request in DDE, it actually requires two cells, one cell to request the data, and a different cell to actually specify the type of data which should be displayed in that cell. So in the sample spreadsheet, after you load that, all you need to do to use it is just enter your Trader Workstation username into cell B5. So this isn't a socket-based technology, so it doesn't use a socket. It connects via the username, and that happens to be the username of the paper trading session. And then you just highlight a row and click on Request Market. What that does is that activates a macro, which is in VBA code, to actually create the DD request itself using the shown parameters in that row. So in this case, what it did is it pulled these four parameters as well as the username, and with that it created a request with the correct syntax to pull data. It placed that request into this cell P13. So this is the actual DD request itself. So in creating your own spreadsheet, this is just a very simple sample, but this is what the actual request would look like, which you could place into a cell on a different page and it would still work. So just as a demonstration, if I were to copy this, okay, and then place it over here, okay, and then I could copy those other ones too, and that's all you would need. So you wouldn't need any of the other macros from this page. So this is, for instance, for the bid size. This is for the Euro-USD currency pair, which provides real-time market data for that currency pair. In DD, as I mentioned, it's frozen from this point forward in development, so we won't be adding new features as they come out, the DD in particular. But it does have real-time data with all the default tick types. It doesn't support other types of data, but if that suits your purposes, it's perfectly functional, and some people actually prefer it. But all we would need to do to make our own request, our own spreadsheet, would be these two formulas, one for the request and one of actually how to return data. So I can go back into the other spreadsheet, okay, and then I'll just paste this. And you can see that I'll just continue to update the same way. So that's all you need to have a DD request for market data. You would have one cell for the request and one cell to return data. So that's, I mean, it's more complicated than RTD server. RTD server is, it's even simpler than this, but this isn't, it's not that cumbersome. Okay, so that's DD. So on the DD sample spreadsheet, it has examples of the other types of tasks which DD can do. Most of them require some VBA code. For instance, if you want to receive historical data from DD that is available, but it requires a DDA code, a short bit, to actually process and parse the return data. So if you go into the sample spreadsheet in the VBA editor, you can actually see where that occurs. And actually in our API guide, we have different chapters on that for using DDE. There'll be one for requesting market data in real time, a tutorial, and also one for receiving historical data. And the historical data, it just has the very basic code, sort of the simplest possible code, which would need to be in a spreadsheet to be able to parse and return historical data. Okay, so that's DDE, and DDE can be used for a lot of other things, as we demonstrate here, like placing orders, receiving your current open orders, receiving executions for the current day, receiving current account values. So that is all available from DDE. And then finally, the third technology would be ActiveX. ActiveX, as I mentioned, is also a wrapper for C#. We recommend usually the clients to use C# directly rather than using ActiveX, but ActiveX does have the advantage that can be used with Excel. It does require more programming than the other technologies because it requires VBA to actually load the ActiveX control and then execute commands within it. But I can just sort of load this up to show what it looks like and to show how you might connect. So in ActiveX, it is also socket-based, so you specify a port, the port on TWS, which you're trying to connect to. And then from the first page in the sample spreadsheet, it's a General tab, which shows the connection. And then we have other tabs, which show all the other technology, all the other functionality. So for instance, this is a Tickers tab, which shows how to make a market data request from ActiveX. This does require VBA code, unlike the other Excel technologies. But it works much the same way in the sample. You just highlight a row and then click on Request Market Data. And that will populate the other cells in the field after you connect. Okay. In ActiveX, it does have all the other tick types available. And it is currently updated in real time, so every time there's a new feature to the API, it will also be included in ActiveX. Okay, so I think that's a fairly good overview. I know I covered a lot of material. Hopefully it wasn't too much. Let's see if there are any other questions which have been unanswered. Okay, just read through these. Okay, so I see one question, a good question about market data subscriptions. I'm not sure if that's an answer, but that's a good point. So this is, in this particular account, I do have those market data subscriptions, which allows me to pull real-time data for an instrument. There are several requirements to be able to pull real-time data. Those are under the market data section in our API guide. If you go under live market data, it describes the 3 requirements to be able to pull live market data into Excel. So first, basically, you just need to have the live market data in TWS to be able to get it in Excel. That requires trading permissions for the instruments you're requesting. It requires a funded account for most instruments. And also, you have to have live market data subscriptions. You can receive delayed data in RTD server now. There are just other tick types for delayed data. So you would just specify that as your tick type as delayed, and then you'll be able to receive it. I'll show where those are here. Okay, so if you scroll down to delayed tick types, these are the different delayed tick types which will be available even without the real-time market data subscriptions. So you can get things like delayed bid, which would be a bid price from, say, 10 to 15 minutes ago, delayed ask, delayed last price, delayed last size, delayed high, delayed low. So those are available even if you don't have market data in the account. An RTD server, as I mentioned, it currently only has capability for real-time data, so it can't receive historical. In the other technologies, if you do have market data subscriptions in your account, you can also receive historical data. That would also require the same subscriptions. Okay, I think that's good. It looks like all the questions I see have been answered. Good. Anything else I should talk about, Cynthia, or I forgot?
I think you've covered quite a bit here today, Josh, so thank you very much. And if there are no additional questions, looks like this is a good time to exit today's session. Oh, I see a couple more might have just come in, Josh.
Oh, let me take a look.
I see they're coming in. There are a couple of thank yous there. So do take a look at that.
See, so there's one question about in terms of losing events, which I'd mentioned a little earlier about. So anytime you're using Excel as a trading application, it definitely is not as quite as robust as a custom-made application, which is built specifically for trading that would make in a different technology like C# or Java. I definitely think the RTD server does a better job because of the way the structure of it and not being able to potentially drop events if there's a different task going on in Excel. So in Excel, if there's like a dialog box appearing or you're interacting with a spreadsheet, then at that time there's always the potential possibility that Excel in the background won't have the computing power to be able to receive events in real time. So that's definitely something to think about in building a trading application. That it's not as robust, but I think RTD server definitely does a better job because of that mechanism it has of only requesting data when Excel is ready for it, and not just being sent data all the time. Okay. Anything else I missed?
Well, I think that's going to